To look into Matthew chapter 26, verse 1 through 13. Again, Matthew 26, 1 through 13. It is on the screen now for future reference. Before we get into that, let's go to the Lord in prayer, please. Father God, thank you so much for the blessings you give us. Thank you so much for those who have served today. We are so grateful to have willing service, and we just praise you right now for all the blessings you give us, for the answered prayers, and also we pray that you be with the remainder of the service today. In your Son's name, amen. I would like to say that I feel like our kids have done great today. We had a last minute trying to get kids together, and we had these four young ladies that came up and said, not only would they do it, but they were excited to do it, and I feel like they've done a great job. And many of the guys didn't even know they were serving communion until this morning, so I'd like to kind of catch them off a little bit. So I do appreciate that, guys. Really, we have a great group of kids, and it shows when they're willing to do stuff like that. What is beautiful? I don't use the word beautiful very often. It's just not in my vocabulary from day to day. Matter of fact, I rarely use the term beautiful. I would say that, obviously, I would say my wife is beautiful, and if I don't say that, that's not very smart. But other than that, there's very few things that I call beautiful, and I've always struggled with that. Whenever you hear a song on the radio, and it's a nice song, and someone say, well, that's a beautiful song. And I've always struggled with that. I was like, beautiful? I don't see how a song can be beautiful. I don't understand that, or pretty, or anything like that. I understand women use those terms a little bit more, but I find it fascinating that when I'm watching football, I will use the term beautiful quite a bit. Except for when I'm watching the Colts play, and then I don't use any of that. But it's amazing when men watch football what words we say. I mean, good words. And so... But I will say pretty, beautiful, oh, what a beautiful play, how can that be beautiful? I mean, when I just say, oh, my wife is beautiful, but also football's beautiful. Kind of a difference. I like to eat too, so a lot of times I'll use beautiful when it comes to food. Oh, that's beautiful pizza. But let's find somebody that have a little bit better things to say about beauty than I do. Helen Keller, which many of you known, was mute and blind, deaf, couldn't really, besides all that, was able to talk. And one thing that she said, which someone that really can't see beauty the same way that really any of us can, says this: the most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. And how true is that? When you look at something and you're moved and you're saying that's beautiful, that's not coming from your sight. It's coming from in here. Beauty is found within the heart. St. Augustine says, love is beauty of the soul. Now, those are all great quotes, but I think in order to get better quotes, we have to go to the Word of God. And one better than that is, or some that are a little bit better than that are, is found in Psalms 45:11, says, let the king be enthralled by your beauty. Honor him, for he is your Lord. Ezekiel 16:13, 14 through 14 says, so we are adorned with gold and silver. Your clothes are washed with fine linen, costly fabrics, and embroidered cloth. Your food was honey, olive oil, finest flour. You have become very beautiful in the rose to be a queen. Your fame spread among the nations, and account of your beauty, because the splendor I have had given you made your beauty perfect, declares the Lord. The last one I want to share, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 4 says, your beauty should not come from the outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles, wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothing. Rather, it should be of your inner self, unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is the great worth in God's sight. All three of these verses have one thing in common other than they mention beauty, and that is that each and every one of them are talking about us. This is what God says beauty is. When He looks down and He sees us, He says this is beauty. This is beautiful. I was looking at, we're doing our worship time on Sunday nights, and so I was looking at some of the new songs that are coming up to see which songs that I wanted to add to our worship. And I was doing that earlier this week, and one of the songs that I told Emily what I was doing, and one of the songs that she brought up was, I really like the song Beautiful Things. And that was a song that we played as everybody was coming in, so you may have not seen much of it or heard much of it, but that song, whenever I listened to it, I was touched and I was moved because it talks about how God makes beautiful things. And He makes beautiful things in us, and He makes us to make beautiful things. And I feel like that song really touches a lot. So as children of God, I think we must know that God looks at us and says, we're beautiful. By using the book of Matthew, we will find 4 ways that God has made us beautiful. How when God looks at us, He says, this is beauty. The first that I'd like to point out is God has called you to be you. He has made you beautiful already, and so He calls you to be you. Now, the passage that we are looking out of talks about a woman and a kind of an unusual thing that she did, and we're just going to kind of explore that. Now, the start of chapter 26, it deals with Jesus sitting down with His disciples, having a meal together. They're eating, they're kind of just hanging out, and He goes to them, and He starts just teaching them, because I'm sure Jesus did this a lot, where He was teaching probably when they were walking, probably when they were eating. He was probably teaching all the time, and even John makes reference to that. But as He was finished talking to His disciples, verse 2 tells us, as you know, the Passover is coming 2 days away. The Son of Man will be handed to be crucified. So right now, Jesus is already telling them that I'm going to be crucified. Now, this is the week, Jesus' last week. It looks like it's the day before the Last Supper. And He is telling them, hey, I'm going to be crucified. If you were one of His disciples, what are you thinking right now? Okay, you're going to die in 2 days? How do you know that? And there was a lot of doubt going on there because, they've seen Him do miracles, but people don't go around saying, I'm going to die in 2 days. That's not a common thing. That's not a common thing then. It's certainly not a common thing now. And so what was going on through their heads? I feel like that most of them probably didn't pay enough attention to that. And based on what we read ahead of time, we see that most of them looked at that and said, okay, Jesus, whatever. You're just, we'll see. We'll find out. I don't know that any of them took them seriously. And we see by their reaction of His death and by what they did after He died that probably was the case. And then in verse 3 through 5, it kind of takes away from what they were doing, and it goes to Caiaphas. And Caiaphas was the chief priest at that time by the Jews. This is the Jewish chief priest. And he kind of got a group of people together, and they were secretly going to kill Jesus. But they said, hey, you know what? We want to do it before the feast, before the Passover. So basically, he's like, okay, we're going to get this group together, and we're going to kill Him now. We're going to get this done. And so he's getting this group together. And Mark actually goes into, when he talks about this, that when they were together, that's when Judas popped up and said, hey, what are you going to give me if I turn Jesus over to you? So we see that they're secretly trying to get rid of Jesus. This is before the apostles really know anything about it. And Jesus has already told the apostles, you know what? In 2 days, I will be crucified. And so they're kind of going through this and kind of wondering what's going on. And then we see a very, very beautiful story of a woman stepping up and listening and really soaking in, taking in what Jesus has said. And this is found in starting with verse 6. It says, while Jesus was in Bethany, He was in the home of Simon the leper. And we know very little about Simon the leper. We know that since his name is the leper, that he probably had leprosy at some point. Probably didn't then. He's probably one of the people that Jesus healed from leprosy. And so that's kind of an assumption that holds weight. So we kind of see that he is that. But also, the other thing we know is that he is from Bethany. And there were 3 other people in the Bible, close friends to Jesus that we know that live in Bethany at this time, and that was Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And they lived there at this time, so a lot of people have made that Simon was some sort of relative to those three. Probably a father, they said, maybe an older brother, some sort of connected with them. And then verse 7 says, a woman came up to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. She poured it on his head as he was reclining on the table. So she comes up with this expensive perfume. I mean, it's one of these perfumes that everybody sees, that everybody knows that it's expensive stuff. And she comes up to him, she breaks the jar and pours it on his head. That's not a common practice at that time. You don't just go around to people and dumping perfume on their head. That's not done then, and it's certainly not done now, but it's not done then. And so then the disciples, we see them kind of judging now. They say, well, what a waste. What a waste. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. So this is pretty, I don't think this is a shocking thing. A lot of times when people do something, even for God, there are other people that sit back and say, well, they shouldn't have done that. You know, they shouldn't have done this. They should have done this other than that. And yeah, were they right? She could have sold it for money. She could have given it to the poor. But then Jesus says, in response to that, he says, why are you bothering her? You know, that wasn't your perfume. That wasn't, you had no call to that. Why are you bothering her? And I think one of the more telling verses in this is this, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. He goes on to say that this is in preparation of my burial. So he goes on and says with his disciples, and when I was reading and studying this, every commentary that I saw said that of the disciples, remember we have the 12 apostles, and then they have many other disciples, about 144 of them. And Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were counted in that 144. So she heard him when he said he was going to be crucified. When she heard him, she was moved to the point to say, I am going to prepare you for burial. Perhaps the only one in that room that took what Jesus said literally and seriously. And that is why Jesus said, hey, she's done this beautiful thing because she is doing what I am telling you that needs to be done. What needs to be done is I need to be prepared for this burial. And that is what she's doing. That is why Jesus was touched by what she did, because she heard what he said and she reacted to that. How wonderful it is when Christians and Jews and followers of Christ, Jews at this time, did exactly and responded to Jesus the way that he wanted them to respond. So the first point is, he wanted you to be you. This was Mary. Now, Matthew doesn't say that. Mark doesn't name the names, but then John tells us that this was Mary of Bethany, Martha's sister. And Mary, this was her. She was one of these people that listened to Christ all the time. We all know the story of Mary and Martha. Martha's running around like a chicken with her head cut off, trying to get things done. And then Mary is listening to Jesus. And Martha says, okay, Jesus, why don't you put her to work? You know, come on. And then Jesus says, hey, she's actually doing what needs to be done at this time. You know, she is listening to me, and that's what needs to be done. And so that was not an unusual thing. This is what Mary did. She listened to Jesus when nobody else would. She knew that when she broke that perfume and poured it on her head, that she would be judged by that, but she did it anyway. She was not perfect. She was not living a perfect life. I think many times when we look in the Bible, we look at Bible characters, we think that they're way up here and we are way down here. No, she was common. She was as common as anybody else it was in the Bible. And she's definitely nothing that people would look and say, well, she's just all this. She was very common, but she listened to what God had in store. She knew that breaking that perfume and pouring it on her head would be different, be a different thing. But she also knew that that's what needed to be done. And like Jesus said, it was a beautiful gesture. That was what God called Mary to do at that moment. Now, I think one of the biggest well-known stories about God calling is Jonah. And we look at Jonah and we see that story, and when God called Jonah to do this. You notice that in the story, we all know the story, you notice that in that story, God didn't have a backup plan. He didn't have Jonah Jr. in the background, waiting to send in when Jonah said, no, I'm not going to do this. We know that he was swallowed by a large fish, spit out onto an island, and then he went to Nineveh, and in 3 days, all of Nineveh was repenting. And just because this guy come in and said, hey, the world is going to end. If somebody came in here today and said the world is going to end, we'd probably escort them out or talk to them. That's not something. We went to New York City on the way back to the Dominican this summer. And there's all kinds of guys saying that the world is going to end. One guy said it was going to rain down moons. I didn't take him literally. I didn't go run inside and say, hey, when it's done now, people would look at him crazy. But he was gifted. He had that talent to come in, and he sold that. And so God knew what he was doing, but he had a plan for Jonah, and that plan is similar to the plan that he had for Mary at this time. But we can do what God has called us to do, but we can't do that and mean anything if we don't know him. If we don't know God, we can't do any of that. So we got to know God here. We have to know who he is here. She knew that people would judge her. She knew it. We all know that when you do a certain thing, well, I'm going to hear about this. Whether it's from a relative or a boss or somebody else, well, I'm going to hear about this. She knew it was going to be judged, but she did it anyway. She knew that but she gained courage to step up and to pour that over his head and to bless him with that. And that's kind of where she is. Now, Mary's heart doesn't always mean an individual thing. It does also mean it can be a church-wide thing. And we see in Revelation chapter 3, verse 1, the second part of verse 1, it says, I know your works. He's talking about one of the churches, one of the 7 churches. And he says, I know your works, and you have a reputation for being alive, but you're dead. You're dead. And what he means by that is, hey, you do great things. You do a lot of things, maybe even in my name, but right here inside, you're dead. James says faith without works is useless, but works without faith is just as much worthless. She knew him because of the story we just told about her, where she would listen to him, even when Martha was running around serving. Not that Martha was wrong, but serving and doing other things. Mary got to know Jesus here. And my question to you is, how well do you know Jesus here? And we can make up all kinds of things about Jesus. Doesn't mean any of it's true. We can make up that Jesus, we hear that, well, my God does this or my God does that. We can make up anything we want, but we're not worshiping God of the Bible. We're worshiping some made-up God that we want to feel here, but we don't because we're not trying to get to know God. The third thing that I see that we can get out of here is God has called you for his will. He's called us to be us for him. And I think too many times we listen to the devil. We listen to others and telling us, hey, don't be yourself. And then we also hear that all the time. Be yourself, be this yourself. But nobody really tells us how. But God has a call for us. He's got a plan for us, and he's called us to do his will. Now, that's not a selfish thing. He's made us. And he doesn't call us to serve him 24/7. He knows that we need our own time, but he calls us to do what the plan is for us. And many times we say no. But in this case, Mary was obedient. Yeah, it was nerve-wracking. It was a nervous thing. I'm sure nobody's comfortable doing what she did, but she did it because that's what God called. If he's calling her to do something simple, something that probably took 30 seconds, and I'm sure he called her to do other things, I want you to reflect on your own life, and what is God calling you to do? What is God calling you to do that you are either saying yes to, but what are the things that he's calling you to do that you're not listening? The devil is going to go after us. He's going to he doesn't want us, because the reason why the devil sometimes is really after us, and sometimes we feel that not only as an individual, but as a church. When church problems arise, maybe it's not so good that we just point fingers at each other, or maybe when problems in your house that you point fingers at each other, but you will take a reflection and say, what is the devil after me for? Why is the devil attacking me now? What's he attacking me with? Because I tell you what, the devil is scared to death that there's over 200 people in this building worshiping God today. He is scared to death. And he doesn't want that to happen. So he's going to throw out his big guns. He's going to try to trip you up. He's going to try to stop you. And that's when we need to turn to God and say, God, deliver us from this. God, your will, let me do what you are calling. And I know that the devil's going to go after me, but I am going to do exactly what you have called me to do because I want your relationship with you. Because the devil's not going to give up. Oftentimes we think that being a Christian, it's good, it's nice. We all talk about all the great things, and it is wonderful. It's the biggest blessing we have is to have that relationship with God. But when the devil is attacking us, then we need to acknowledge that he is there and he is using other people to attack us instead of wasting our time pointing fingers at each other and getting mad at each other and not talking to certain people. The last point is God has called you for you. He has called you for you. Now we talk about how we need to serve God and we need to have the willingness to serve God. And how it's challenging because the devil's going to throw your busy schedule on that. He's going to throw all kinds of things that are personal to you. He may use your spouse. He may use your kids. The devil plays dirty. He's not going to play by any kind of rules. But if we're serving God, then the biggest reward is going to come in here. It's not going to be somebody, the biggest reward may come if you paint somebody's house or if you do something for somebody. Yeah, they'll get rewarded. But if you're doing what God has called you to do, your life is going to be wonderful in here. And if it's wonderful in here, it's going to be wonderful out there. But she needed to be a light to others. At this time, the disciples, they were good spiritual leaders, but at this time, they were confused. They didn't know what was going on. They needed, even though she's not a huge, strong leader, they needed that little bit of light. And when she rose up to give that light, she showed them that, hey, I have that relationship with God, that I know when I do this, I am serving Him. We all know that there are times where we do something for God and we just feel closer to Him. We just feel like that we're growing in Him. And I've heard people say, well, I can't really serve right now because I need to work on me and God. Well, if you know God, and we are made in God's image, we all can agree that we are made in God's image. If you don't agree with that, read Genesis and then tell me if you don't agree with that, because it tells us that we're made in God's image. But then, in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8 says, whosoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. The most beautiful thing that I can think of is right now that God has made us to love and be loved. We are loved by Him, but He has made us to be loving people. If we are not loving people, we're not really of God. We don't have that relationship with God. We don't know God. We may have a made-up relationship with a made-up God, but we don't have the relationship of God the Jehovah. Because He has called us, not only called us to love, but has created us to love and to be loved. So those are the three calls or commandments that God has given to us. He has called us not only to be ourselves, because God can use you in I don't know how many different ways. Only you know what God can use you for. And God has also called us to know Him, to have that relationship with Him. It is extremely important to have that relationship with God. He has called us to do His will. And if we have that relationship with God, if we are ourselves, then doing His will is pretty simple. It's just kind of like breathing. And He has also called us for us. We not only reward others, we not only reward God, we only do the will of the King, but we are rewarded. God has made things very beautiful. And I want to end with this thought. We can look around the earth, go home and look out your back door and you can see some beautiful things. and know that they're from God. You know, what else did God create them but to bless us? And if you're in my life group, don't just be quiet right now and don't tell anybody this because this is pretty cool. Light travels at 186,000 miles a second. That's pretty fast. That's booking it. To give you an idea of how fast that is, if you get in your car and you drive about 60 miles an hour, and you made, if it was even possible, you wanted to drive around the equator. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but just say for the sake of argument, you do want to do that. So you're driving your car 60 miles an hour. If you had this car that had an empty tank, or an endless tank, and you don't have to stop, all you have to do is drive nonstop. You don't have to go to the bathroom. You don't have to eat. We'll just say that this car is just continually going to try to circle the earth. It would take you 2.5 weeks nonstop to circle the earth. 2.5 weeks. That's kind of a long time to be in a car. You know, I complain for being in the car for 4 or 5 hours. You know, this is crazy. And so think about that. That's one time. Light travels light travels around the equator 8 times in 1 second. So what would take us in a car nonstop 2.5 weeks? Yeah, light did it 8 times in 1 second. 8 times. So that's pretty fast. And so that's light traveling at a year that fast, you're talking about billions and billions of miles that it's covering. If you were to get into a rocket that travels the speed of light, and you were to travel 31 million years, which by the way is a long time, then you would get to this galaxy. And you can put on the next slide, please. And this galaxy is called the Whirlpool Galaxy. And if you kind of look at it, you kind of see a whirlpool. You know. And so it's really cool because it's perfectly perpendicular from the Earth. So when we look into a telescope, we can look right into it, which is very unusual. You know, that's pretty much it. This is the only galaxy that we can do that to. So we can look right into this white dot there. You see the white dot in the center? We can look straight into that. The only galaxy that we can do that is 31 million light years away. So it's far away, and we can look straight into it. Now, the beautiful thing that when we see and we look straight into that white dot, here's what we see. Next slide, please. We see a cross. Why did God do that? Because He can. And because He loves us. This is what we see. God has made these beautiful things, and He has put a signature on them saying, hey, I did that. That's me. And that's cool. That's neat. I love that. But then also, there is something called laminin. And laminin is a protein molecule. I can't say that word very well, so don't make fun of me. Oh, you can make fun of me. I don't care. That holds different cells together. So it is the glue. Without laminin, we just basically fall apart. So it's the glue. It's the thing that holds us together. And the crazy thing about laminin is that when you look into a microscope, here's what you see. Next slide. You see a cross. And there's 2 pictures just to know that this isn't unusual. These are 2 pictures. You see a cross. So not only did God create the universe, the humongous universe, but He has put His signature all over us because we are His most prized possessions. We are His beauty. You can also go back to the creation. And every day of creation, God said, hey, it's good. It's good. It's good. Next to the last day of creation, 7th day He rested, the 6th day of creation, He created man. And He says, it's very good. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. So God has made us beautiful. And the greatest thing that we can do to respond to Him is just to tell others that we are beautiful. To create beautiful things in our own lives. That's it. That's all we have to do for God. So I want to challenge you today, in your own life, to make things beautiful in here and just allow God to create beautiful things through you. Guys, come on up, please. If you have a decision to make, if you need prayer, you can come up. We'll pray for you. You can seek out one of the leaders, the elders. They'll pray for you. If you need to make a decision for the first time in your life, I want to invite you to do that at this time as well.
Please stand.
He is jealous for me.